Deputy Marnes.
Please, Sheriff.
I want to go out.
The first episode of the new Silo series opens with a voiceover of the character Sheriff Holston as we watch him getting ready to leave his apartment. In that, he lays out the reality of what it's like living in the silo, saying, "We do not know why we are here. We do not know who built the silo. We do not know why everything outside the silo is as it is. We do not know when it will be safe to go outside. We only know that that day is not this day." It's a lot of questions to have related to the basic history of a community that was so clearly planned out, that also understands itself to be made up of the last 10,000 people on Earth. Apparently, there was a rebellion 140 years ago that's responsible for their history being erased. But as the sheriff's wife Allison points out, things don't exactly add up. If the rebels destroying their history was such a bad thing, why do the people in charge restrict things like relics that are connected to their past? It's suspicious, but we see that the people who live there have an investment in believing the story, as evidenced by the Freedom Day celebration. The one thing they know for sure is that the world outside is toxic, and as far as they can tell, there's no safe way to explore it. That adds a dystopian flavor on top of everything else, and makes it very surprising when the sheriff, who comes off as a by-the-book straight shooter, declares that he wants to go out. This is the cardinal law of the society that lives there. Any spoken request to leave the silo is granted, but it's irrevocable. Once uttered, it's determinative. In other words, it's a death sentence. And Deputy Marnes' reaction to Holston's declaration underlines the severity of what he heard perfectly. A couple of details to know about the silo are that it's broken up into 3 sections of 48 floors each. They're known as the up top, where most of the characters we meet in the beginning live, the mids in the middle, where Allison goes to meet fellow computer geek George, and the down deep at the bottom, where Holston meets Juliet at the end. The story takes place at some point in the future with people who appear to be descendants of Americans. They have access to some technology, so some things about how the silo was designed are strange, like how it doesn't have any elevators and it takes an entire day to walk the levels from the top to the bottom. This has an effect of localizing things between the different sections. People from the up top rarely visit the down deep without a good reason, and vice versa, and there's some otherization that goes along with that. Even with such a small population, there are divisions. It's not as extreme as something like Snowpiercer, if you're familiar with that, but the groups do in a way see themselves as different types of people. Perhaps an oversimplification that works well enough is to say that the people in the down deep see themselves as the working class, whose labor is the backbone that keeps things running. And people from the up top see themselves as a higher class of people who do the important jobs. There isn't a huge disparity in quality of life though, so more than anything, it's a situation where each group thinks that theirs is the quintessential role in the silo, and that it would fall into chaos if they weren't there to keep it going. I've read this series as it exists in its current form of 3 novels titled Wool, Shift, and Dust. The first season of the show covers about the first half of Wool, and it becomes apparent fairly quickly how the name is connected to what's going on as the phrase "pull the wool over your eyes" comes to mind. The other wool reference is that the cloth they use to clean is made out of it, but in the recent AMA the author did, he mentioned that he included that detail as a way to keep things obscure. I'll say that I enjoyed this series overall, but what made me excited to see an adaptation was that Hugh Howey's original series leans heavily toward plot. In a lot of ways, the main character is the silo itself and how it got there rather than the people who live inside and push to understand the answers to those questions. This isn't a bad thing. The author had some interesting ideas he wanted to explore, and does a good job of doing that. But the television format opens the door to further develop these characters along the way. I think episode 1 is a great example of how that could work, because the 2 characters we spend the most time with just have this short appearance. Holston and Allison and their situation are there to introduce us to the world and give us an idea of what life is like inside this silo. In the episode's opening, we find out that neither of them will live to be the main character in the story, but we still get to spend some time with them and get to know them. Knowing them helps us understand each subsequent character we meet and how they experience life in this strange setting. Through them, we also get a better idea about the rules and that there are restrictions on who can have children. Even though they had 2 unsuccessful attempts before, they've been approved for a 3rd through a lottery. They have a year to try to conceive, and we watch as her mandated birth control device is removed. She works in IT, which is something that we'll learn more about in the future, and she has a rebellious streak that her boss Bernard doesn't appreciate. As she's talking to her husband, we get some details about why things are the way they are. As a lawman, he's unsympathetic to any of his wife's talk about questioning the rules, and mentions that something called the Pact is the only history they have. And he's not exactly wrong. They know people that go outside to clean do die as a result. And when we meet the mayor, we also see that if no one goes out to do that, it starts to get hard to see what the outside looks like. The pact and the rules appear to be necessary to keep order in a place where space is limited, and where they do essentially have everything they need. Giving up some control doesn't feel like too high of a price to pay. A woman named Gloria, who comes off as conspiracy-minded, gets Allison's attention when she asks if she thinks she's the kind of person they want having children. By the look on her face, you can tell this is something that hadn't occurred to her. But we've seen that for all intents and purposes, they're doing their best to try to get pregnant and it's not working. Holston thinks this is ridiculous and threatens to send the psych team to pay Gloria a visit for making his wife upset. From his point of view, all of these questions are senseless. But the stress of the year they spent trying to conceive, and her meeting with George, who shows her a particularly restricted relic of a hard drive from before the rebellion, has started to make Allison question what she can believe. We'll learn more about relics and how they're regulated as things progress, but the idea that she could be sent outside for looking at this drive makes Allison hesitant at first. She eventually gives in and looks at the files, where she finds footage that shows that the world outside looks very different than what they've seen on the screens. I guess I should point out that even though it looks like a big window looking out into the world in the cafeteria, it's actually a large screen. All of the floors of the silo are underground, and what they clean when they go outside are sensors on a small tower that sticks up above the ground. Allison also learns that they never took her birth control device out, and those two things together make her decide that the only way to prove that the destruction outside is a lie is to go out herself. Before she left, she told her husband that if the world is actually green like she believes, then she'll clean. If not, then she'll walk away. So when Holston sees her clean, it's confirmation that there's something going on out there, that the world looks different than what they've seen their entire lives. But then he's devastated to see that his wife still dies moments after she confirms that. From there, we skip ahead to 2 years later and see Marnes tell Holston that George, the programmer that Allison was working with, who had also transferred out of IT to work in mechanical, has been found dead. And it appears that he committed suicide by going over the railing on level 120. Although Marnes tells him that one of the engineers in the Down Deep insists that it was murder. So the two of them take a trip down to mechanical to meet Juliet, who is an engineer, and they find her busy at work working on the generator. The episode ends with one more jump forward to the present, where we go back to the holding cell where Holston went in the beginning of the episode, and hear him explain to Marnes that he's going outside to find Allison, even though they can see her dead body laying there right on the screen that's displayed on the wall. The second episode opens with technicians getting ready to send him out. You see them preparing his suit. You see Mayor Johns and Deputy Marnes going through the same motions that he went through when he was sending Allison out, and he apologizes to them for all the fuss. When he gets outside, he sees that same lush landscape that she saw, with the same birds flying by that you saw reflected in her glasses while she was watching the file that was marked Jane Camedy cleaning with George. He takes this as a sign that she was right and says to himself, they have to see. Then he does what everyone else before him has done. He cleans the sensors, and then he goes to walk away. When we see things from his perspective, his wife's body's missing from the hill in front of him. But when he starts to die, he takes his helmet off, and then you see him start to crawl directly to her body so that they'll rest together. So when you put two and two together, you realize that the lush landscape is what you see inside the helmet. It's implied that it's there to get people who all say they won't do it to clean. Allison, seeing this on the computer first, was convinced that it meant the truth was being hidden from them, and her signaling to Holston that it was true got him to follow her out there. But they both still died, which means the air is toxic, and as far as you can tell, what the people see on the screens is how things really look out there. This changes the question from what's going on when people go outside to who set this up this way and why. In his office, Marnes opens the letter that Holston left for him, and we'll find out later that it says that he wants Juliet to be his replacement. The mayor was expecting him to step into the role, but he says he's retiring, and he keeps Holston's pick a secret for the time being. There's a real concern about stability now that the sheriff is gone, and you see some fear amongst the population who start arming themselves. You also get introduced briefly to the character Sims, who works for Judicial, who come off as an intelligence service that operate independently from the sheriff's office. We watch as Juliet freaks out after she saw Holston die, and she leaves the cafeteria calling him a liar. Later, she'll tell her friend Martha, who has a workshop where she's been hanging around since she was a kid, she doesn't believe George killed himself because the last time she saw him, he was excited about something. He told her that he had something to tell her, and then he left a Pez dispenser relic with a note that said that he had found what he was looking for in her room. The morning after she receives this, she finds out he dies, so they never see each other again. And because they weren't in a sanctioned relationship, it's not easy for her to explain why she's so sure he was murdered, but the local deputy agrees to send her concerns to the sheriff anyway. Holston does decide to come and look into it at that time, which was a few months before his death. When pressed, she shows him the Pez dispenser and the half of the note that says, "Remember the last place you saw this." Then she takes him to an underground chamber that nobody is supposed to know about. It's massive and houses what she thinks is the machine that excavated the silo in the first place. According to legend, after it digs that far down, there's no easy way to get it out, so the founders just walled it off with 30 feet of concrete. If you go back and look at the scene where he's looking at the plans for the silo on his computer, you can see where that is. I should mention that all of this is added for the show. In the book, the excavator is introduced with the same line that she says about burying it, but it's from a different character in a completely different context. And there you never really get to see the relationship Holston and Juliet have. The scenes that they share here make his choice to pick her as his successor make a lot more sense, and I think this is all a big improvement. When she discovers that George hid the hard drive for her, she discovers why Holston was interested in coming down to look into the case. He tells her that his wife did some IT work for George just before she went out, and this is where things start to get interesting and everything starts to make sense. There's a great back and forth here where Juliet is upset because he didn't tell her about George's connection to Allison, and she starts to worry that it's going to affect how she handles his case. She says she wants him to do his job, which she says is to find the truth. But he counters this saying that it's actually to maintain order in the silo. So at first, he's adamant that he needs to destroy the drive. And then she says maybe if he had listened to his wife, she'd still be alive. This ties back to the conversation he had with Allison, where she tells him that talking isn't listening, which was right after she removed her birth control. And then what he said to Marnes about he should have followed her out 3 years ago, but he couldn't listen. This all gets him to change his mind, but there isn't much that he can do publicly. So he tells her to keep her head down and that he'll send her a sign and that she'll know what it is when she sees it. Then we go back to her talking to Margaret, where she says that that's what she did, and she never got her answers, so that's why she called him a liar whenever she saw him die. She also shows her the other half of the note she never showed the sheriff, and then leaves to go to try to find out what George found. Elsewhere, Marnes eventually shows the mayor Holston's last request to make Juliet a successor and to give her his badge even if she refuses. He thinks this just goes to show that Holston wasn't in his right mind before he died, but she still wants to meet Juliet. So they decide to walk the 144 levels to see her, which I guess we'll see in the next episode. This episode ends with Juliet returning to George's hiding place, where we see a brief flashback of their time together. In their conversation, he tells her that he's looking for a door, which he thinks leads to the tunnel, and that it's under the water. She tries to overcome her fear and use the rope he left behind to explore herself, but it cuts to black after she almost falls into the water and watches her light sink to the bottom. I think this was a really solid start to an adaptation of a story that I think has a lot of potential. There are quite a few changes, but most of them seem to be related to making this into a TV show. One example that stands out, when I first read it, I thought of the silo being a lot more claustrophobic, especially the staircases. Here, everything seems a lot more wide open, but that also looks a lot better for TV. There's little things like there being a screen down a mechanical, and they all sort of wear regular clothes instead of coveralls, which is what they wear in the book, but none of these things feel like they fundamentally change the story. And if you're wondering, the author of the books was involved with the writer's room. And from what I understand, he suggested a lot of these changes, including the ones that really add a lot to the story, like the time that Holston and Juliet spend together. One of the things I liked about these books was that they do answer all the questions they ask, and those revelations come at a fairly consistent pace as the story develops. Looking at just these 2 episodes, I like how they set those mysteries up. I can tell you that if you know what to look for, there are a ton of Easter eggs and visual cues in every scene, although it's not necessarily a puzzle to solve as much as a lot of these things will really pop out to you on a rewatch. Juliet is definitely the main character, which means there is a lot riding on Rebecca Ferguson's performance, and I think she's doing a great job so far. Since I basically know what will happen, I can't do any speculation in good faith and should probably leave it there, but I'd be very interested to know what you're thinking about after you watch these 2 episodes in the comments. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.